This week's reading is by a brilliant historian named Don Bohulano Mabalon, a mentor, a friend, and a professor that was here at San Francisco State University. Her historic writings on Filipino American history and Filipino American life in early American history has been the cornerstone of my work and so many other Filipino Americans' work. Before Dawn passed away, she was really working a lot on exploring the histories and the contemporary foodways of Filipino Americans. This chapter on As American as Jackrabbit Adobo, she defines for us what exactly is a foodway. Quoting a historian named Hasia Diner, she writes on page 148, quote, foodways include food as material items and symbols of identity. And the history of a group's ways with food goes far beyond an exploration of cooking and consumption. It amounts to a journey to the heart of its collective world. In her introduction to this chapter, she wants us to understand that Filipino American foodways historically are a global phenomenon to begin with. And in this lecture, you'll find Don and Professor Mabalon's findings in terms of historical archival work into how Filipino and Filipino American cuisine is already always global. In this complete chapter around Filipino history and Filipino American migration, it's kind of amazing how Mabalon starts from pre-colonial Spanish Philippines, thinking about what Filipinos perhaps in the north, in the Ilocos region, were eating in terms of pinakbet, the dish that she talks about, and the kind of crops that are grown out of that area of the Philippines. Brilliantly, Mabalon talks about the foodways that were created by Spanish colonization of the Philippines. She talks about the Manila Acapulco galleon trade, the ships that went back and forth between Spain, Mexico, and the Philippines, and how that global enterprise of colonial trade in spices and labor and resources influenced the foodways of what would be another staple Filipino dish, adobo, a stew that is mixed with some salt or soy sauce, as Chinese influence would have it, vinegar, garlic, and other spices. A global dish in its core, adobo is a global dish, Mabalon argues, because in the Filipino foodway, it always existed in the exchange of the ingredients and the ideas of the food. Following another global trend, Mabalon also studies Filipino migration to the United States. Her book, Little Manila is in the Heart, is about the settlement of the largest Filipino community in the early 20th century, which was in the Central Valley in Stockton, California. Here is where Mabalon's historian prowess, her brilliance, really comes alive. She argues that wherever Filipinos settle in the United States, they take their dishes with them, but they also fuse it with the land, water, resources that they find in the different places that they make community in. She talks about salmon sinigang as harvested from the San Joaquin Delta. She talks about bear adobo, black bear caught in Alaska by cannery workers and them turning that into the dish that they brought from the Philippines, the knowledge that they knew how to cook tough meat like bear meat. She has lots of historical archival evidence from interviews and second generation, third generation Filipino Americans that talk about how their food changed with their life in the campos, in the camps, in the canneries. And not only did Filipino food change, but it changed Filipinos' cultural values as well. how does a foodway change Filipinos? Isn't it just about food? Well, Mabalon says no. Foodways, as she quoted earlier in the chapter, isn't just about cooking and consumption. It's about the collective heart and the community that that foodway belongs to. Mabalon argues that because there weren't a lot of Filipino women that were migrating at this time, many Filipino men stepped up to start to create Filipino American cuisine. And that then changed how Filipinos, the immigrants that were here, how they thought about gender and how they thought about who was supposed to cook and who was supposed to provide that very essential labor of cooking food for the community that they were part of. This global foodway for Filipinos starts in colonialism in the Philippines, follows them through to their immigration to the United States. But Mabalon's brilliance really shows in that she says that it doesn't just change the Philippines or Filipinos, but actually, as American as Jackrabbit Adobo, Filipinos changed the American landscape in terms of labor. In this chapter, she talks about how these foodways really transformed American history because many Filipinos became central to changing ideas around farm worker labor and organizing around these really difficult working conditions in Central Valley and in Alaska canneries, unionizing and really organizing politically together. So it wasn't just changing the Philippines. The foodway wasn't just changing what they ate, but also changed the United States. Mabalon would argue that Filipino American history is actually American history. In this week's project assignment, leading you up to this first unit project, I want you to trace a recipe that you use. Maybe you look at something that your family has cooked for a long time and trace the global foodways that it is a part of. You could think about the material items, but you can also think about the communal practices that that foodway might have changed or continue to change it these days. Until next time.